Two little girls in suits walked into a billionaire CEO's office with resumes in hand. What they said next changed his life forever. Stephen Carter's office sat on the top floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, a place where order reigned and interruptions were filtered out long before they reached his door. The morning had started like every other. Back-to-back meetings, a stream of data reports, a market projection session with his financial team, and a dozen emails requiring nothing less than perfection. Stephen, the CEO of Carter and Company, was known for his precision, his cold decisiveness, and his uncanny ability to predict numbers before they hit the page. Tall, sharply dressed in a pale blue suit, with dark brown hair immaculately styled and ice blue eyes that rarely betrayed emotion, he ran his empire like a machine, efficient, logical, unfeeling. But that particular morning, something cracked the machine's rhythm. At precisely 10:03 a.m., his assistant Margaret knocked. She never knocked unless it was critical. When she opened the door, she looked uneasy, which immediately caught Stephen's attention more than her words. She cleared her throat and said, "Sir, there are two little girls here to see you. They say they have resumes." Stephen blinked. "I'm sorry, did you say little girls?" Margaret nodded, clearly unsure whether to laugh or panic. "Yes, twins, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Identical, blonde, glasses. They're wearing shirts and ties. They say they came for a job." He stared at her for a long moment, assuming it had to be a joke. Maybe a prank sent by a rival firm or some viral internet stunt. But Margaret looked too genuinely confused for that. "Send them in," he said, finally, leaning back in his chair. "Let's see what this is about." Less than a minute later, the heavy doors to his office opened, and in walked two tiny girls dressed in white button-down shirts, red ties, black skirts, and polished shoes. Their hair was neatly brushed into matching ponytails, and they carried slim red folders clutched tightly to their chests. Each wore round glasses. They walked side by side with a kind of focus and seriousness that belonged more in a courtroom than a corporate skyscraper. Stephen stood, his brows lifting slightly. "Girls, are you lost?" One of them stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but completely steady. "No, sir. We came to apply for a job." He looked at them carefully. Not just children playing dress-up. Not just wandering in for attention. These two had an unusual kind of composure, like they knew exactly what they were doing and why. He gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Sit," he said, almost testing them. They did, quietly, without fidgeting. "I'm Stephen Carter," he said. "I run this company. May I know your names?" "I'm Avery Holland," the first girl said. "I'm Amber Holland," the second added. "And what kind of job do you believe I have available for people your age?" "We've prepared proposals," Avery said, opening her folder. "Market strategy simulations," Amber continued. "We analysed your Q2 reports and have some ideas." Stephen's curiosity now overtook his disbelief. He opened the folder in front of him. Inside were printed documents, colour-coded graphs, basic balance sheets, stock movement diagrams, and a short write-up that suggested adjusting Carter & Co.'s investment approach in a small but thoughtful way. The language was surprisingly clear. The math was correct. The suggestions were not childish. "Who helped you prepare this?" he asked, slowly. "Our mom," Avery said. "She was a financial analyst," Amber added. "She homeschooled us. We've been learning economics since we were 4. Stephen swallowed. "And where is your mom now?" There was a beat of silence before Avery answered, looking him directly in the eye. "In the hospital. She has cancer. Stage 4, Amber added, her tone just as calm. "We need to help pay for her treatment." Stephen felt something shift inside him, a dull throb in his chest, not from pity, but from something deeper: recognition. The kind that happens when the world tilts slightly and you realize you're no longer standing where you thought you were. He leaned back in his chair. This was not a game. These girls weren't here for attention. They were here because their world had collapsed, and someone had taught them that intellect, not tears, might be the only way to survive it. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Stephen Carter didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a man who was about to make the most important decision he'd never expected to face. Stephen Carter couldn't stop thinking about the girls even after they had left his office. For the rest of the day, his meetings passed in a blur. PowerPoint slides and strategic forecasts faded behind the image of Avery and Amber sitting calmly across from him in their oversized shirts and red ties, explaining portfolio diversification as though it were just another after-school subject. The way they spoke, the maturity behind their eyes, the way they worked in tandem without needing to interrupt or correct each other, it was as if they had spent years preparing for that very moment, not as a performance, but out of necessity. He sat alone in his office long after the building had emptied, staring at the folders they had left behind. He had kept them, telling himself it was just for reference, but as he read through them again, he knew it was more than that. Their work, though simple, was undeniably competent. No, not just competent, thoughtful. They had used actual company data, charted basic market responses, and even proposed contingency plans based on quarterly fluctuations. He'd seen full-grown analysts submit reports with less insight. He found himself opening his laptop and typing their mother's name into his internal HR database. Then the financial networks he trusted. Jenna Holland. She had indeed worked as a financial analyst. Her reputation was solid. No red flags, no scandals. Her last published article was a breakdown of post-recession consumer spending behavior, sharp, clear, persuasive. And then, a sudden stop in her career. He followed the timeline and saw what the girls hadn't said directly. She had left her career just a few years ago, most likely when their father had walked away. Stephen didn't know why it bothered him so deeply. Maybe because he had always believed success was purely a result of effort, focus, and will. But these girls had applied all of those things, not for fame or pride, but because their world was slipping out from under them. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. It wasn't just their intelligence that struck him. It was their discipline. Their mother had clearly taught them everything she knew, but it was more than academics. She had given them structure, focus, and resilience. The next morning, before anyone else arrived, he called Margaret. "Find out which hospital Jenna Holland is in," he said. "I want confirmation, and make it discreet." By 10 a.m., he had his answer. Jenna was in a public hospital on the city's west side. Stage 4 cancer confirmed. Insurance was minimal. Family contact, none listed. Primary visitors, 2 minors, listed as daughters, Avery and Amber Holland. He sat with that information for a long time. There was no one else, no backup plan. These 2 girls were facing the kind of future no child should have to carry alone, and they had chosen to fight it not with desperation, but with logic and preparation. He found himself recalling their faces, so small but so sure of themselves, and felt something in his chest clench unexpectedly. Later that day, he called them back to the office under the pretense of discussing their proposal. He had prepared a space in one of the conference rooms, stocked it with notebooks, colored markers, a whiteboard, and 2 lightweight laptops adapted for child use. When they arrived, Escorted by security who looked more amused than concerned, they immediately sat down and began working, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Stephen stood in the doorway, watching them silently for several minutes. There was no playing, no distractions. Avery was reading over a PDF he had sent them in advance, highlighting sections and jotting notes. Amber was already sketching a bar graph based on projected tech sector growth. They weren't pretending. They weren't acting like children trying to be adults. When he finally entered the room, they both looked up, expectant but calm. "I've reviewed your work again," he said. "You clearly have a strong grasp of market basics. But tell me, what do you expect to happen here? Do you expect me to pay you salaries? Give you full-time jobs?" Avery looked at him steadily. "Number, we expect you to give us a chance to learn and to prove we can help." Amber added, "We don't want handouts. We want to be useful." It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't manipulative. It was honest. That, more than anything, unsettled him. These girls were everything the adults around him often failed to be: honest, driven, and clear in their intentions. He sighed and nodded slowly. "All right, I'll create a temporary internship program, unofficial. No pay, but you'll get supervised access to basic analytics and you'll report to me directly. Agreed?" They nodded in unison, and a strange warmth flooded the room. As he left them to their work, he tried to shake the feeling that his life had just pivoted, subtly but irreversibly. He had made a decision, not just as a businessman, but as something he had never allowed himself to become: a guardian. And somewhere deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Over the next several weeks, the office began to shift in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. It didn't happen all at once, and no one dared to speak of it directly, but everyone felt it. The atmosphere, once sterile and cold like the numbers they dealt in, grew warmer. Where there had once been only the rustle of reports and the clicking of keyboards, there were now small voices, the tapping of tiny shoes, and the occasional, restrained giggle that echoed from the far end of the 12th floor. At first, the staff thought the two little girls were simply a passing curiosity, something strange and temporary, like a CEO's eccentric experiment. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear: Avery and Amber weren't going anywhere. Stephen had given them a space of their own, a repurposed glass-walled conference room near his office. It had started as a quiet corner with a few child-sized chairs, a laptop, and some office supplies. But slowly, it transformed. By week 2, the room had a whiteboard filled with basic financial formulas in colourful marker. There were posters of bar graphs they had made themselves, and sticky notes labelled with terms like equity, diversify, and risk tolerance. There was a logic to their setup, a system to how they worked together. Avery often began the day by reviewing economic headlines, while Amber translated that information into visuals or mini presentations. They gave each other feedback, corrected mistakes without offense, and functioned more efficiently than some of the junior analysts Stephen had fired in the past year. He didn't micromanage them, he simply watched. When he had time between meetings, he would glance in through the glass wall to see them debating something over an open spreadsheet or scribbling calculations across their notepads. Once, passing by unexpectedly, he heard Amber explaining short-term market volatility using a stack of sugar packets and a paperclip. Avery corrected her with a quiet, "That only applies if we're talking about emotional sell-offs," and Amber adjusted the explanation without missing a beat. Stephen didn't interrupt. He just stood outside the room and stared, wondering how on earth children who had barely lost their baby teeth understood things that took most adults years to grasp. More than once, A visiting investor or partner would pass by and do a double take at the sight of the two tiny interns. Stephen always explained it with a quiet, measured line. Temporary research assistants. Special case. He didn't elaborate, and no one pressed him for details. That was part of the unspoken rule when it came to Stephen Carter. You didn't question what you didn't understand, especially if he seemed dead serious about it. Despite their growing presence in the office, the girls remained strangely unobtrusive. They were never loud, never demanded anything, never distracted from the larger operation. In fact, several employees admitted that their productivity had increased, if only because they didn't want to look incompetent in front of the CEO's young protégés. It was humbling to watch two 7-year-olds calmly dissect revenue trends while half the boardroom scrambled to explain a dip in quarterly earnings. But what began to trouble Stephen, quietly, deeply, was how rarely the girls mentioned their mother. They never complained, never asked for help, never once used her illness as a bargaining chip. If anything, they worked harder as the days passed. The only time he saw a crack in their composure was one rainy afternoon when Avery dropped her pencil and bent to pick it up. For a second, she froze beneath the desk. When she emerged, her eyes were red, and her hands trembled slightly as she tried to resume writing. Stephen didn't say anything, but that moment lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. Later that evening, long after the girls had gone home with the car service he arranged for them, he sat alone in his office. Outside, the rain fell in a steady rhythm against the windows. He stared at his reflection in the glass, the same carefully constructed man he'd been for years, and for the first time, he asked himself a question that didn't have a tidy answer. Why did he care so much? These weren't his children. He wasn't responsible for their pain. And yet, he couldn't stop picturing Avery's eyes behind her glasses, filled with a sadness too old for her years. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he read everything he could about Jenna Holland's case. Her condition had worsened. She was in and out of consciousness, undergoing an aggressive round of treatment that, according to the hospital reports, was likely a last effort. There were no family members listed, no backup plan, just two names, Avery and Amber, listed as primary contacts. And the girls knew it. They were carrying that weight silently, showing up every day to work as if they could somehow earn enough knowledge or impress the right adult to stop what was happening to their mother. The next morning, he called a private oncologist and asked for a consultation, sparing no expense. He also contacted his legal team and asked them to begin looking into emergency guardianship procedures quietly. He hadn't told the girls yet. He wasn't even sure what he'd say. But something had shifted in him, and there was no turning back. That day, when Avery handed him a freshly printed chart on startup valuations, he took it without looking, and instead asked, "Have you had breakfast today?" They exchanged a glance, confused by the change in subject. "Just toast," Avery admitted after a pause. "Bagels from the break room?" Amber added, as if to soften the truth. "Come with me," he said, standing. They followed him to the executive kitchen, and he made them both sit at the table while he prepared a proper breakfast: eggs, toast, sliced fruit. They watched him silently, almost suspiciously, but when he set the plates in front of them, something eased in their posture. For the first time since they'd arrived, Amber smiled without calculation, just a small, spontaneous smile, and said, "Thank you." Stephen nodded. But the truth was, he wasn't sure who he was doing this for anymore, them or himself. All he knew was that every day they were there, he saw less of the world he thought he understood and more of the one they were teaching him to see. Stephen had always believed that his life was best lived at arm's length, from people, from chaos, from anything unpredictable. He had built his empire that way, through control, structure, and an unwavering focus on outcomes. But ever since Avery and Amber had stepped into his office that strange morning with their red folders and quiet determination, his rules had started to blur. And now, only a month later, he was no longer the same man. He still wore the tailored suits, still ran a company valued at over $1 billion, still scheduled his day down to the minute. But in between conference calls and board meetings, he found himself worrying about what the girls had for lunch, whether their shoes fit properly, or if Amber's cough, barely noticeable to anyone else, was getting worse. It wasn't just his world that was changing. The girls, too, were transforming, but in subtler, quieter ways. Though they still arrived early and stuck to their routines, he could see the edges softening. They laughed now sometimes. Amber started doodling on her notepads, tiny rockets and market charts with smiling faces. Avery, always the more serious of the two, had begun asking him questions that weren't strictly about business. Things like what his favorite book was as a child or if he believed in luck. He wasn't always sure how to answer, but he did anyway. One afternoon, after they had finished helping organize data for an upcoming pitch, Avery approached his desk with a hesitant expression. She clutched a slip of paper in her hand and extended it silently. Stephen took it, unfolding it carefully. It was a hospital visitation schedule. Mom, Avery began, her voice unusually uncertain. She's getting worse. They said we might not have much time. Can we go visit her tomorrow? We'll make up the work after. Stephen didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the skyline he had spent years climbing toward. For so long, success had meant numbers and contracts, media mentions, and expanding global reach. But now, standing there with two fragile little girls waiting for his approval to see their dying mother, none of that seemed to matter as much as it once had. You don't need to make up any work, he said, turning back to them. Take the whole day. I'll come with you. They both stared at him in surprise, as if the idea of an adult volunteering to step into their personal life was foreign territory. Amber opened her mouth to say something but didn't. She simply nodded, and Stephen saw in her eyes a flicker of something that looked like relief. Brief but real. The next day, they drove together in silence. The hospital was grey and sterile, perched at the edge of the city like a forgotten institution. Inside, the walls were pale and the lights too bright. Stephen walked beside the girls, his usual stride slower, more uncertain. They knew exactly where to go, as though they had memorized the path long ago. Outside the room, they stopped. Avery took a deep breath, then pushed open the door. Jenna Holland looked far older than the photos he'd seen online. Her skin was pale, paper-thin, and her hair was almost completely gone. Tubes trailed from her arms, and the steady beep of machines filled the air. But when she saw her daughters, she smiled, not brightly, but with all the strength she had left. They rushed to her side, each taking a hand, and for several minutes there were no words, just the quiet connection between a mother and the children who had held her world together. Stephen remained near the door, unsure of his place. But then Jenna looked over at him and said, "You must be Mr. Carter." He nodded. "Stephen, thank you," she whispered, "for everything you're doing for them." "I'm not doing enough," he said, almost before he realized he meant it. She smiled faintly. "You're doing more than anyone else ever tried to do. That counts." They spoke only briefly. Jenna was too tired to say much, but before they left, she asked to speak to him alone. The girls hesitated, but stepped out, trusting him without needing to be told to. "I don't know how much longer I have," she said, once the door closed, "but I need to ask you for something that I never thought I'd say to a stranger." Stephen didn't speak. He simply waited. "If I die before they're old enough to protect themselves, I need to know someone will. I don't mean charity, I mean love. I need to know they'll be seen, heard, treated like more than just a burden." Stephen felt the weight of her words hit somewhere deep in his chest. He wanted to promise, right then and there, but he also understood the gravity of what she was really asking. It wasn't a legal agreement. It wasn't financial support. It was devotion. "I can't replace you," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to," she replied. "I'm asking you to care." He looked at her for a long moment, then finally said, "I already do." Her eyes closed slowly, as if that was all she needed to hear. When they left the hospital, the girls didn't ask what had been said behind the closed door, and he didn't offer it. But when they got back into the car and began the ride home, Amber curled up beside him instead of sitting by the window like she usually did. Avery rested her head against the seat with her eyes closed, but her hand crept quietly across the leather seat until it touched his. He didn't move away. That night, Stephen didn't return to his penthouse. He stayed in the house he had recently bought just outside the city, a place with too many rooms and not enough life in it, because suddenly it didn't feel so empty anymore. It felt like something waiting to be filled. And for the first time in his adult life, he wanted to fill it with something that wasn't a number or a success story. He wanted it filled with them. In the days that followed the hospital visit, something shifted, not just in Stephen, but in the girls as well. Avery and Amber continued to arrive early, do their work, and engage with the same intensity they always had, but the veil of formality they had worn so carefully seemed to ease around the edges. There were small signs, quiet moments that Stephen noticed more and more. Amber began humming while working on data visualizations, soft, almost melodic sounds that filled the quiet conference room with something human. Avery, usually so strict about the precision of her notes, let a doodle of a cat slip onto the corner of one page. Neither of them apologized. Neither felt the need to explain. Stephen, for his part, began to rearrange his schedule. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that his mornings started with breakfast prepared for 3, and his afternoons left space for reviewing whatever mini project the girls had taken on that day. His staff had learned to stop commenting on it. Some watched him with raised brows and exchanged whispers about how the coldest man in the building now carried lunchboxes in his car and corrected math problems in red pen between meetings. He didn't care. He had never been someone who made room for chaos. But these girls weren't chaos. They were structure hidden inside unpredictability. They were exactly what he had been missing. One morning, Amber arrived without her usual enthusiasm. Her steps were slower, her smile absent. Avery clutched her hand tighter than usual, guiding her into the elevator with quiet urgency. When they reached their office space, Stephen noticed immediately that Amber's normally animated energy had dulled into something muted. She sat down heavily, placed her folder on the desk, and stared at the blank page without opening it. Stephen approached gently, crouching beside her so he could see her eyes. "Amber," he asked, "are you feeling okay?" She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether she was allowed to answer honestly, then finally whispered, "Mom didn't wake up when we visited last night." Stephen didn't speak right away. He looked over at Avery, who was standing at the corner of the room, her posture tense and unmoving. She didn't say anything either. She simply stared at the floor. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and the words felt insufficient, too small. "Do you want to go see her again today?" Amber nodded, then shook her head, then whispered, "We're scared it'll be the last time." Stephen stood slowly and walked over to the window, needing a moment to gather his thoughts. His heart, so used to operating in strategy and numbers, had no script for this. He turned back toward them and said, "Then we won't wait. We'll go now. I'll cancel everything." Amber looked up in surprise. "You can't cancel work." "Yes," he said, grabbing his coat. "I can." They arrived at the hospital within the hour. The air in Jenna Holland's room was heavier than it had been before. Machines still hummed steadily, but her chest rose and fell more slowly now, as if even breathing had become a negotiation. The girls took their places beside her bed automatically, one on each side, their small hands slipping into hers with practiced care. Stephen stood by the door again, unsure whether he belonged in such an intimate moment. But this time, Jenna opened her eyes. They were weak, fogged with pain and medication, but they focused when they saw her daughters. Her lips moved, barely forming words. "My girls," she whispered, and Avery leaned in closer. "We're here," Avery said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her mother's forehead. Stephen moved a step forward. Jenna's gaze flicked toward him, recognizing him even through the haze. She motioned with her fingers, small, barely visible, and he understood. She wanted to speak with him again. He leaned down beside her bed, and she whispered, "Have you decided?" He didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'll take care of them." Her lips trembled, and the faintest smile appeared. "You already are." Avery and Amber stayed with her for another hour, talking to her even when she couldn't respond. They told her about the stocks they were following, about the newest report they were working on, and how Stephen had let them drink hot chocolate in the office kitchen. She didn't speak again, but her eyes fluttered with each word, as if she were memorizing the sound of them. When they finally left the room, Amber didn't cry. Avery didn't ask what would happen next. Instead, they both turned to Stephen, standing just behind them, and Avery asked in a voice that was far too calm for her age, "Can we stay with you tonight?" He knelt so that they were eye level and nodded. "Yes, as long as you want, as long as you need." That night, the three of them returned to the house outside the city. It was the first night the girls stayed there officially. Stephen had their bags carried in, and though the rooms were too big, the furniture too formal, and the space far too quiet, it no longer felt empty. He made them grilled cheese sandwiches, not because he knew how, but because he had Googled it while they were asleep in the car. They ate at the kitchen counter, their feet swinging above the floor, and for the first time since their mother had fallen ill, they laughed, not loudly, not recklessly, but freely. After dinner, they found the guest bedroom and climbed into the same bed, refusing to be separated. Stephen stood in the doorway, watching them curl under the covers. Just before he turned off the light, Avery whispered, "Can you leave the door open?" He paused, then nodded. "Of course." And as he walked back down the hallway, he realized that no part of this had been part of his plan. But for the first time in a very long time, that didn't scare him. It felt right. It felt like the beginning of something he hadn't even known he was missing. The morning Jenna Holland passed away was the quietest Stephen could remember. It was early, barely 6:30, when the call came, his phone vibrating silently on the nightstand beside him. He stared at the screen for a moment, already knowing what it would be before he even read the name. The hospital. The nurse's voice was soft, trained for this kind of delivery. There were no complications, no pain. Jenna had slipped away peacefully during the night, her breathing slowing until it simply stopped. Her daughters had not been there. Stephen thanked the nurse quietly, his voice tight but composed, and sat in the stillness for several minutes before getting out of bed. He didn't wake the girls right away. He walked down the hallway and stood outside their room, listening to the gentle rhythm of their sleep. When he finally opened the door, the sight of them wrapped under the same blanket, breathing in unison, hit him harder than he expected. He sat down at the edge of the bed and waited until Avery stirred. She blinked up at him, confused, but alert in the way children become when they sense something is wrong before they've been told. Amber shifted beside her and rubbed her eyes, yawning quietly. Stephen didn't have a speech prepared, no script to follow, no elegant way to say what had to be said. "She passed away last night," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Peacefully, in her sleep. The silence that followed was heavy and slow. Amber's small face folded first. Her lips trembled and her eyes filled instantly, but she didn't make a sound. She simply reached for her sister. Avery wrapped her arms around her tightly, burying her face in her neck. Stephen sat still, helpless, as they held each other and cried. He didn't leave the room. He stayed seated beside them, one hand on the blanket, a silent presence in the storm. When their sobs began to fade into the kind of shaking that comes from pure exhaustion, he gently asked if they wanted to stay home. Avery nodded. Amber didn't speak, but she didn't resist. That day passed slowly. Stephen cancelled every meeting, rescheduled every call, and sent a single email to his executive assistant. "I'm unavailable today. Family emergency." It was the first time in his career that he had used the word family in that context. He spent the day with them, moving quietly through the house, preparing food they barely touched, watching cartoons they didn't really pay attention to. Once in a while, Amber would ask a question about what would happen now, about funerals, about what people were supposed to wear. Avery asked fewer questions, but Stephen knew it wasn't because she didn't have them. It was because she was trying to stay strong for her sister. That responsibility, that weight she carried, made his chest ache. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table, the three of them surrounded by plates that had gone cold. Stephen leaned forward, trying to find the right words for something bigger than anything he had ever negotiated in a boardroom. "You're not alone," he said simply. "I don't want you to worry about where you'll go or what will happen. You're safe here. If you'll let me, I'd like to become your guardian officially, permanently." The room was still. The girls looked at each other. There was no dramatic response, no gasps or sudden hugs. But Avery blinked quickly and whispered, "She wanted that. Mom wanted that." Stephen nodded. "I know. She asked me before she passed. I promised her I would protect you." Amber finally looked up at him, her eyes red but steady. "Will you still let us go to the office?" He almost smiled. "Only if you promise to keep correcting my spreadsheets." That night, he called his lawyer. Emergency guardianship paperwork had already been started days earlier when he'd asked them to prepare it just in case. Now it was no longer theoretical. It was necessary. Within 24 hours, temporary legal custody was granted pending court approval. The next few days were hard, filled with phone calls, funeral planning, logistics no child should ever have to witness. Stephen shielded them from as much as he could. He arranged everything, quiet, tasteful, exactly as Jenna would have wanted. Only a small circle was invited. He stood behind the girls at the graveside ceremony, his hands resting lightly on their shoulders, anchoring them. When the final words were said and the casket was lowered, Amber reached up and slipped her hand into his. He closed his fingers around hers and didn't let go. That night, after the guests were gone and the house was dark and still, Avery knocked on his door. "I don't think I know how to be okay," she said. Stephen set aside the work he hadn't really been doing and looked up at her. "You don't have to be okay right now," he said. "You just have to keep waking up. That's enough." She stepped inside and sat beside him, and after a long pause she asked, "What if she forgets us?" "She won't," he said without hesitation. "But if you're ever afraid of that, we'll remind each other. Every day, if we have to." He didn't know exactly when the shift occurred, when the girls stopped being a responsibility and started feeling like part of him. Maybe it had happened the day he let them eat cereal in the conference room. Maybe it happened when Jenna trusted him with their lives. Or maybe, quietly, it had begun the moment he looked across his office at two tiny girls in red ties and decided to listen. All he knew for sure was that grief had wrapped its arms around the three of them, not as a final ending, but as the painful beginning of something entirely new, something they would have to build together, piece by piece, day by day, and he would be there for all of it. Spring arrived slowly that year, almost shyly, as if the season itself wasn't quite sure how to show up after the weight of winter. The mornings were still cold, but the air began to smell different, fresher, less heavy. Trees outside Stephen's house started to bud, small green leaves unfolding with stubborn gentleness. And for the first time in weeks, light filtered through the windows without feeling intrusive. Inside, the house no longer felt like a museum. It breathed again. It adjusted. It began to carry sound. Amber's humming as she brushed her teeth. Avery's soft footsteps heading to the kitchen early to make tea. The click of keyboards in the evenings when they chose to finish small tasks together at the breakfast table. There were still hard days, still moments when grief crept in like a shadow they couldn't quite shake, but it no longer swallowed them whole. It just existed alongside everything else. At the office, their presence was no longer questioned. Everyone knew them by name. Employees stopped acting surprised when they appeared at meetings or quietly slipped into brainstorming sessions, carrying their folders and notebooks like they belonged there, because they did. They had even started contributing more actively. Stephen gave them small but real tasks, proofing minor reports, summarizing basic trends, and sitting in on certain internal reviews. Avery had a knack for spotting patterns most analysts missed, and Amber had started drawing simplified diagrams that his marketing team found more intuitive than their own. One Friday afternoon, Stephen hosted a quarterly check-in with several investors and key department heads. The room was packed, suits, graphs, tension in the air. Stephen had planned to keep the girls out of it, not because he didn't trust them, but because he knew how ruthless corporate environments could be. But right before the meeting began, they knocked on the glass wall of the boardroom. He looked at them, then at the long table filled with skeptical faces, and simply gestured them in. They walked in calmly, took two chairs at the side of the room, opened their notebooks, and began listening as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Halfway through a presentation on market volatility, one of the newer financial managers made a prediction based on a shaky assumption. Stephen was about to speak up when Avery raised her hand. The room went quiet. The young man presenting froze, confused. Stephen looked at her and nodded. "Your assumption depends on last year's Q3 pattern," she said clearly, but that pattern was an anomaly. It was driven by supply chain delays, not actual consumer behavior. The correlation won't hold this year. There was a pause, then a shift. A few heads turned. Someone whispered, "She's not wrong." Stephen let the silence settle, then said, "Continue," as if her correction had come from any other executive in the room. The meeting resumed, but the energy had changed. By the end, no one was looking at them as a novelty anymore. They were participants. After the investors had left and the conference room was empty, Avery looked up at Stephen and asked, "Was it okay that I said that?" He knelt beside her chair and said, "It was more than okay. You were right, and you were brave." Amber beamed. "I drew the supply chain delay in our notes as a dragon eating all the trucks." Stephen laughed out loud, a rare, unguarded sound that startled even him. At home that night, they celebrated with pizza and a movie. Amber fell asleep halfway through, curled under a blanket on the couch. Avery stayed awake just long enough to whisper, "Do you think Mom saw us today?" "I do," Stephen said, "and I think she's proud." There were still things to figure out. Legal processes, school transitions, therapists who specialized in grief. But the foundations were setting. Their routines no longer felt borrowed. Their presence in his home and in his life no longer felt temporary. The house had children's books on the shelves now, and a puzzle perpetually in progress on the dining table. There were mismatched socks in the laundry, glitter pens in his desk drawer, and a crayon drawing of Stephen the Shark pinned to the fridge. Everything was a little messier and warmer. Stephen found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. He no longer stayed at the office until midnight. He no longer ignored birthdays or skipped holidays. He read up on childhood development and asked his HR department to look into mentorship programs. He took the girls to a bookstore one weekend and let them each pick out 5 books, then bought 10 more just because he couldn't say no when they started reading aloud in the middle of the aisle. One evening, as he walked past their bedroom, he heard Avery's voice reading softly to Amber, who was half asleep. He stood at the doorway for a moment, unseen, listening. The words were from a story about a girl and her map, a map that kept changing, forcing her to find her way over and over. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. He realized then that grief didn't disappear. It didn't soften into something manageable overnight. But it made room for joy, for love, for healing. And the more space they gave it, the less it demanded in return. By the end of spring, he no longer called them his interns. He called them his girls. And when people asked if he had a family, he didn't hesitate. "Yes," he'd say, "2 daughters, unexpected, brilliant, and very much mine." Summer came with a kind of stillness that felt earned. After months of loss, adjustment, and rebuilding, life for Stephen, Avery, and Amber began to find a steady rhythm, one not dictated by tragedy or survival, but by something simpler and softer. The mornings were no longer rushed or quiet out of grief. They were filled with cereal bowls clinking, debates over who got to use the last clean spoon, and discussions about which tie Stephen should wear to his meetings. The girls were sleeping in their own rooms now, each decorated in the colors they'd chosen themselves. Avery's walls were pale green and lined with shelves of books, while Amber's were bright yellow with maps and posters of constellations she couldn't yet name but wanted to learn. Stephen had changed in ways no one could have predicted, least of all himself. He still showed up to the office early, still led board meetings with his signature calm authority, but his days were no longer carved out by bottom lines alone. He left early when school let out. He attended parent-teacher meetings. He signed permission slips and learned the names of every girl in Avery's chess club and every boy in Amber's art class. His life had become filled with small, specific things: missing buttons, forgotten lunches, handmade cards slipped under his office door. And for the first time in his adult life, he welcomed the interruptions. When the girls' final custody hearing came, he dressed more carefully than he ever had for any investor meeting. His tie was slightly off-center, and Amber fixed it without saying a word, standing on tiptoe with tiny, confident fingers. They sat in a waiting room full of other families in various states of disrepair or hope. Stephen held both girls' hands as they waited to be called in. And though he was surrounded by chaos, he felt a calm resolve, unlike anything he had experienced in the boardroom. This wasn't a deal to close. It was a promise to make official. The hearing itself was short. The judge, a warm woman with silver hair and a voice like weathered wood, read through the case file and asked only a few questions. The girls answered calmly, politely. Avery spoke first, explaining how Stephen helped her with math in the evenings, and Amber followed by saying he made the best spaghetti in the world, even if he always burned the garlic bread. Stephen answered questions too, about Jenna, about his commitment, about his future plans for the girls. When the judge looked at them and smiled gently before saying the words, "The petition is granted." Guardianship approved. There was no fanfare, no music, no dramatic gasp. Just a long, quiet exhale from all three of them. Avery squeezed Stephen's hand. Amber rested her head on his shoulder. He signed the papers, and just like that, they were a family. Not by blood, but by every choice that had followed the first one. That night, they held a celebration in the backyard. Nothing grand, just pizza, string lights, and a movie projected on the wall. Some of Stephen's closest colleagues came. Margaret brought cupcakes. Even his notoriously reserved head of finance showed up with a board game and pretended not to cry when the girls hugged her. Avery and Amber wore matching dresses they'd picked out themselves, and Stephen, in jeans for the first time in years, grilled hot dogs badly and let them laugh at his lack of skill. As the sun set, Avery stood up in front of everyone and, in the most matter-of-fact voice imaginable, said, "Thank you for helping us get here. Our mom taught us how to think, but Stephen taught us how to live again." Amber, never one for speeches, simply grabbed Stephen's arm and said, "You're the best dad we could have imagined." Stephen didn't cry, not in front of everyone, but later, when the house was quiet again and the girls were asleep upstairs, he sat alone at the kitchen table with a glass of water and let himself feel everything. Grief, relief, gratitude, love. It overwhelmed him in the best way. He looked around at the cluttered countertop, the papers covered in glitter glue, the forgotten sock under the chair, and knew that this mess, this joy, this noise, was what life was meant to feel like. In the weeks that followed, they created new traditions. Sunday morning pancakes became a ritual, no matter how uneven they turned out. They read one book together every month, sometimes a fantasy, sometimes a classic, always with a discussion at the end. The office adjusted too. The girls had summer desks there now, and no one batted an eye. Their presence reminded everyone that even in a world of numbers and deadlines, there was space for humanity. By the time fall came, Stephen no longer introduced them as his wards, or even just Avery and Amber. He said, without hesitation, "My daughters." And when people looked surprised, he smiled, not with pride in himself, but in them. They had chosen him as much as he had chosen them. Their lives had started in heartbreak, but they were no longer defined by it. They had built something from the ruins, carefully, quietly, and completely. And in doing so, they had all found something they didn't know they were looking for. Not just healing, not just safety, but home. In my view, the ending of this story isn't just heartwarming, it's deeply meaningful. It doesn't rely on dramatic twists or grand declarations, but instead honors the quiet power of choice, healing, and found family. What began as an improbable encounter between a hardened CEO and two grieving, brilliant little girls slowly grew into something authentic and lasting. Stephen didn't set out to become a father. He didn't even know he was capable of that kind of love. But love arrived anyway, disguised in matching glasses and red ties, and demanded to be acknowledged. The girls, too, didn't look for a savior. They asked for a chance, and in giving them that, Stephen saved himself in the process. What makes the ending so powerful is that it reflects a real truth. Family isn't always chosen by blood, but by loyalty, care, and the everyday decision to stay. It's not just a happy ending. It's a believable one. And it reminds us that sometimes the most unexpected people can become the most essential part of our lives.